in Spain and Greece and Portugal would be now if people were not allowed to move freely inside the euro area. So they would be even worse than they are. Not that mobility is amazing, but it's there, and many people end up by leaving because they just want to find jobs, or better jobs somewhere else. This is sort of the basic. Integration is absolutely key. But as you will see with the euro application, everyone knew that the euro area would never qualify as an optimum currency area, it's just as the US does. But there would be other things that should be taken into account when considering if overall it would still be a good idea to go for the euro problem. And one of the considerations is the similarity of the economies. So think about a bit of an extreme. Suppose you have a currency union between two countries, one that still has 40% of the population in the primary sector, in agriculture, and the other one that has 3%, like the UK, 3% of the population in agriculture. Now, industry and services and agriculture and primary sector are very, very different. It's extremely unlikely that the two countries will be hit by the same shocks. So this lack of similarity of economic structures is going to make the asymmetric shocks a lot more likely. So if countries have more or less the same economic structure, if, for example, the countries specialise in terms of trade in the same sort of goods and services, so high-skilled goods, for example, then it's more likely that they will be faced with the same shocks. So as you can see, what this is telling us is that even if the euro did not have the same integration in terms of capital mobility, labour mobility and trade as the US, say, with the UK, if these countries had similar economic structures, and I'll talk about the other two, then the project would still be a fairly sensible one. Now, the degree of business cycle synchronization. This should, I hope, be straightforward. For the economies, if there's a group of economies booming, so growing rather too quickly, there's another group of economies, so periphery economies in the euro, that are in a big recession, and you have one interest rate, then you're in trouble. Because the booming economies, you would want to reduce demand by increasing interest rates. In the economies in recession, you would want to slash interest rates. So which interest rate should you choose? You're never going to be able to satisfy the two groups. And typically, as I told you, you'll go for the group that is more powerful. This is in an economic sense as well as in a population sense. Yeah? So if the economies are the business cycles are very, very well synchronized, this is not going to happen. There's an enormous amount of trade between the two groups. Then, typically, when one group is in recession, the other group will also be in recession. And think about why. It should be easy. The country, the big economy, enters into recession. So everyone, including households and firms, is buying less stuff than before. But the stuff that you buy is produced in your country as well as abroad. So, because you're in a recession, you will be importing less stuff from the other economies. And what does that mean? It means that your recession is very likely to cause a recession in the other economies. Because you're buying less, and therefore the other economies are exporting less, and therefore they're producing less output. And of course the British government is well aware of this because even yesterday George Osborne used this thing as the euro is in crisis and the euro area is in crisis, and we are the biggest, they are our biggest trading partner, to argue why is it that the British economy is no longer growing as fast as it was 6 months ago. So this connection is very important. So you don't have to be producing exactly the same goods and have exactly the same economic structure. It's always going to be the case that Southern Europe is going to specialise in sunny tourism rather than the North, because the North doesn't have a lot of days of sunshine compared to the South. But you need a big amount of integration. You really need to be exporting and importing huge percentages of GDP. And if that happens, when one region goes into recession, the other one goes into recession, so the same interest rates would be suitable for the two regions. And when one region is growing too quickly, it's very, very likely that the other region will also grow too quickly. And again, one common interest rate should be enough. Yeah? And this thing, as you will see, is another way one could have thought about the Euro project as being something that was not ideal, but it could still work pretty well. Fiscal federalism. So there would be a European budget, and you would transfer money to the regions that are doing poorly. Yeah? But as I'll show you, the European budget is just absolutely peanuts compared to national budgets. So I know that David Cameron was sort of funding his fees some weeks ago. We're not paying $2 billion. Guys, $2 billion relative to the size of the UK budget is absolute peanuts. The UK budget is something like 800 plus billion. So it is really a drop in the ocean. So, of course, for the typical person, the typical Brit that hears 2 billion, they kind of say, oh my God, those Europeans, they're so horrible. First, they have no idea how many zeros there is in 2 billion. And all they're thinking about is that they're earning £20,000. And so, if you have the Prime Minister of the country saying 2 billion, those naughty guys from Brussels, they will say, yes, he's right, let's vote, let's get out of this horrible European Union. This is politics, but I mean, it's a disaster. It's just not proper information. Why is it? And even the BBC, when they report this, they never said, by the way, 2 billion is 0.whatever% of the current UK budget. And that would have been things to expect. No, they all went for 2 billion, how horrible Brussels is. Yeah? Okay, so as you can see, I do get excited with this position of many people in this country. The Euro, so 18 member countries. As I told you, as you can see, Denmark is not part of it, and neither Sweden. Norway is not even part of the European Union. And here's our little stubborn United Kingdom. Yeah? By the way, we are part of Europe. The media calls it always Europe. We are Europe. It's just, you're an island. It's still Europe. Insane. Right, so let's have a look at those numbers. Do European states trade a lot with each other? They do, but not that much compared to, say, US states. Could the euro have increased trade substantially? Yes. This has not yet materialized. It doesn't mean that it won't. Lots of estimates before the euro, one has to say, had predicted a much greater increase in intra-European trade. So, still the case, there are lots of things, from basic stuff that one should be able to import from everywhere, cars and so on, that are sold for very different prices. And now it's all in euros, of course. Yeah? And that's just silly. And if you want to have a career outside the city or whatever, one good thing someone could do is to actually create information that will allow people to consider, whenever they're buying stuff, to consider buying outside the country. Because if you were to reduce these differences in prices, there would be a very substantial increase in trade. Okay, so this is intra-European trade. So as you can see, it's not low, but it's actually still substantially lower than for the US. Now, these diagrams, I'll show these diagrams quite quickly, because I think all of you have more or less seen these things in the newspapers and so on. So before the euro, before 1999, the interest rates on government bonds and 10-year government bonds were actually quite different. But gradually they converged, and by the time the euro was launched in here, the differences between national government bonds of all of these countries, some clever guy called pigs, although I'm sure you watch a lot more than Northern Europeans. But anyway, so these rates relative to the German rate, as you can see, the difference was equal to 0. So there was essentially, what this means is that financial markets were treating a 10-year government bond issued by the Portuguese government, the Greek government, the Irish government, the Spanish government, as being equally risky to a 10-year German bond. Yeah? And in 2008 and 9, they woke up and said, oops, no, they're not quite the same risk. And as you know, in Greece, this went over the roof, and it meant that they could no longer borrow in financial markets. So they had to borrow from the IMF and the European Union. Same thing happened to Portugal and Ireland. Okay, so this was one of the first causes for the euro crisis. Interest rates, nominal interest rates, decreased very substantially, and they effectively were equal to German interest rates. Now, what about real interest rates? Well, the real interest rate, remember, is the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. Now, the nominal interest rate, as you saw, was more or less the same in Germany and all of these peripheral countries. But inflation rates weren't. And one reason why inflation rates weren't was because these poorer countries were kind of wanted to push for higher wages. And if you increase costs, you increase prices, because firms will reflect higher costs into higher prices. So as you can see, this is now the national real interest rate of all of the same 5 countries relative to the German interest rate. And before the euro, before 96, real interest rates were actually higher, so this difference is positive. After the launch of the euro, so in here, the rates stayed for more than 10 years, 12 years actually, consistently lower. So, to recap, nominal interest rates were the same for Germany and all of these countries, but inflation rates were substantially higher in these peripheral countries, which means that the real interest rate, which is the rate that matters when it comes to borrowing, was substantially lower. And what is it that this fueled? This fueled a big increase in debt and spending spree. So in a lot of the property boom in Ireland and Spain was clearly fueled by very, very low interest rates. As you can see, it was substantially lower than in Germany. And so in 2009, this went into reverse. So that now, because nominal interest rates were substantially higher than the German interest rates, now the real interest rates paid by Greek, Italian, Irish, Spanish and Portuguese firms and households have been substantially higher than in Germany. So what's the manifestation of the spending spree? Current-account imbalances. So look at Greece, huge current-account imbalances before the crisis. Look at Ireland, look at Portugal, and to a less extent, Italy. But Spain has also had very, very large current-account deficits. So they were, remember, if you have a current-account deficit, it means you're consistently, every year, consuming more than you produce. So somewhere in Europe, the reverse must be happening, right? And surprise, surprise, it's happening. It was happening in Germany. So Germany had been running its biggest export in the world in terms of value, and Germany was running huge current-account surpluses with all of these countries. So that's why if you go to Portugal and Spain and these countries, you see lots of German accounts everywhere. People